being somewhat of a millennial, cannot do a presentation without a PowerPoint. So it's a generational gap. As you've seen from our first speaker down, more technology, like I can't do it. So I'm just pulling up my slides here before we can start talking. And also because I understand, like Sam just said, we're trying to make this more accessible to people. And I wanted to do some diagrams instead of having you read, all this text that was created in the 1700s. I've titled my presentation Proposers and Ratifiers. And my goal is to walk you through different versions of what's called Article 5. Basically, one really long run-on sentence in the Constitution that talks about how we can go about amending the Constitution. And I want to talk about Article 5 and how the delegates to the convention were so smart that they even stuck federalism as one little clause in that run-on sentence. Okay? And the reason why I was interested in this is because this year, that's Representative Kevin Stratton right there on the picture, one of our local representatives. This year, Utah passed a Senate resolution calling for something called a Convention of States. Basically, a convention just like the one that we had in 1787, not to create a new constitution, but to propose amendments to our current constitution, right? Now, Utah became the 19th out of 34 needed for such a convention to happen. The 19th state to petition for such a convention. So I'm going to focus on 4 different versions. Now, all of this information I got from the Quill project, which I was involved with while I was a student here. It's weird to say that because I just graduated. But these are the different versions of the plan that I'm going to talk about. The Virginia plan version, the Committee of Detail, Roger Sherman's version, and then finally James Madison's version, which is very close to what we have today, and how the idea of amending the Constitution changed from version to version. First, we're going to start with the Virginia Plan version from June 5th. This is at the very beginning of the convention. The Virginia Plan was basically a series of suggestions that Madison had written up before the convention that he took to the convention, and there the delegates started debating and discussing on whether these suggestions would be a good new form of government for our country. It says, resolved that the provision ought to be made for the amendment of the Articles of Union, whensoever it shall seem necessary, and that the assent of the national legislature ought not to be required thereto. In the King's English, basically we should have a way of amending the Constitution because the delegates knew that they were not perfect and that there would probably be things that had to be worked out in the future, right? And I think it's interesting that the very last part of that sentence says that they did not want Congress, the federal government, Congress of Washington, D.C., to be involved in this process of amending the Constitution, right? This suggestion was then interpreted by the Committee of Detail. The Committee of Detail was a body of 5 men, legal scholars, legal professionals, who took all of the suggestions of the Virginia Plan and wrote a first draft of the Constitution. Instead of reading this quote to you, I'm just going to show you a graph of what it is that they came up with. First of all, you start with the states. The states, if 2/3 of the states petition for a convention of states, then Congress was forced to set up such a convention. In red, I've highlighted the words Convention of States in red because they were the ones that would be proposing the amendments, not Congress, but the Convention of States that was set up by Congress. Now, nowhere in this version is there such a thing as ratification, meaning that we could only assume that the Convention of States would set up a way for their proposed amendments to then be ratified and become officially a part of the Constitution. But that was not specified as part of the Committee of Detail version. Then you have the third version of the plan, which is the one that we just saw a second ago, that was from June, to this new version in September. That is an amendment by Roger Sherman. He decides that he wants to add one more sentence in there. Because what had happened between when they first discussed this plan and September 10th was that they had come up with the Connecticut Compromise, or the idea that the Senate would be controlled by the states, that they would pick the senators. Something that, as we learned a second ago, was done away with the 17th Amendment. But basically what Roger Sherman is saying here is that he wants a second method of amending the Constitution that has that actually starts with Congress, right? Because why did the states petition Congress to start a convention when you can just have the Senate control Congress, just start the process? The state-controlled Senate start the process. I'm sorry. So what we have is Roger Sherman did not eliminate the original proposal, which you can see on your right, on your left. And then you have the new proposal. It's a secondary proposal, a secondary method. In this one, as you can see, what's in red is Congress, and what's in blue is the states. It was up to them to ratify whatever it is that Congress came up with, right? So the next proposal was by James Wilson. He says, okay, well, let's set a high bar for ratification. Let's say that 2/3 of the states have to agree on these congressional amendments made by Congress before it become official. And interestingly, the delegates of the convention say no, and they vote down the 2/3. They actually increase it to 3/4, right? So what we end up with is two methods. One is 2/3, right? Petitioned by 2/3 of the states, and the other one is 3/4 when the amendment is started by Congress. This seems to suggest that the delegates until now, they prefer the Convention of States, right? Because they've set a lower bar for the Convention of States. They set a higher bar 3/4, for the congressional route for amendments. Well then, James Madison kind of throws a wrench into all of this. He actually comes up with he combines the language of both proposals and comes up with something different. Take a second to read it. It's kind of long. It's kind of wordy. I do have a diagram of how this worked, basically. But if you read it, this will actually match almost to the T what it is that we ended up with at the end of the convention. By the way, also, this is September 10th. The convention adjourned on September 17th. So this was the very end of the convention. And this is what Madison's proposal came up to be. First of all, once again, in red is Congress. There is no convention of states anywhere anymore on the version that Madison proposes. The states can still petition. 2/3 of the states could petition, and then Congress would have to start the process. But at some point, it has to go through Congress. Congress ends up being a filter. And then, interestingly, Madison also adds a second way of ratifying an amendment. So you could go to the states through their state legislatures, and if 3/4 of those agreed, then it became part of the Constitution. Or you could do state conventions, which were little conventions in each state that were called up only for the purpose of ratifying that amendment, and then they dissolved. It's a very democratic process of going about ratifying, at least for their times, very democratic process of ratifying an amendment. And there's delegates that are not happy because the original idea, as you might remember, was to not include Congress at all. And all of a sudden we find ourselves with this version that is nothing but Congress. Congress has to have a say. So therefore, 5 days later, September 15th, 2 days before the convention is over, they come up with this little clause that they stick into Madison's language. Or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states shall call a convention for proposing amendments. And thus what we end up with is what we currently have now. We have two methods of proposal, and we have two methods of ratification. And you can pick either one. You can mix and match, right? You can have Congress start the process and then send it to the states, or call for state conventions. Now, out of the 27 amendments that we have in the Constitution, 26 were done through the states. One was done through state conventions, which was the repeal to prohibition. Or you can have another option, which is the Convention of States, which I call my escape valve to federalism. Basically, this is a way to circumvent Congress, to prevent the federal government from becoming too powerful, too tyrannical, and to restore that balance when necessary. So, therefore, that is why, to me, this clause is very important. And, it's never been used, but it's always there for us, as we the people, to decide to use it. Now, the only issue with this is that none of the details on how such a convention would be run were spelled out in the Constitution. So when we get there, if we get to the point that we want a convention of states and we get all the states necessary to call for such a convention, we will have to decide what amendments we want, who gets elected to that convention, and so forth. But I think it's important to remember that that legacy and that clause is there for us to use. That escape valve is there for us to use whenever we see necessary. And that is my presentation. Thank you.